We continue this morning in our series during the season of Lent, following the footsteps of Jesus, watching his moves, listening to his words, exploring the deep and life-changing realities of Jesus' journey to the cross. This morning, we come again to a little village of Bethany, the home of Mary and her sister Martha. We meet another family member this morning. His name is Lazarus, and he's sick. So this morning we begin by imagining things from Mary's perspective.
I thought that he would come. I was sure that he would, but he didn't. He didn't come in time. Our brother Lazarus was sick. I don't even know what it was or where it came from. But when I saw Lazarus was suffering like he was, I knew we had to do something about it. I knew that if we didn't do something and do it quickly, our brother was going to die. We had a friend. It's strange to call him a friend. He was more like family. Maybe you've heard of him. He's kind of a big deal around here. Most people know him because of the signs and wonders he's done. Maybe you've heard about him healing the lame man at the pool in Jerusalem, or when he reached out his hand and made the lepers clean, or the time he opened the eyes of the blind man. Jesus. If only he had been here, my brother would not have died. It's not like we were another anonymous face in the crowds that followed him. We loved him, and he loved us. I remember that first time he came to our house. I sat at his feet and listened to his teaching. He was family to us, and he loved my brother. He loved Lazarus. So when we sent word to Jesus that Lazarus was sick, we hoped that he would come heal him. We expected that he would, and we waited. We waited for him to come, but it was too late. Lazarus was dead. He was gone, and still no sign of Jesus. I'm grieving, I know. I'm overwhelmed, I know. But what I want to know is, why didn't Jesus come? It's almost as if he intentionally didn't come. We sought closure as we put my brother's cold, lifeless body in a tomb and rolled a stone in front. Jews from the village came to our home. They sat with us, and we grieved. 2 days went by. We continued to grieve. If Jesus had only been there, my brother would not have died. 2 days turned into 4, and a messenger came to the house saying that Jesus was on his way. Now he decides to come? I don't need him now. I needed him 4 days ago. My brother needed him 4 days ago. I was so overwhelmed with grief that I stayed sitting with the mourners in my home while my sister Martha went out to meet Jesus. She and I often saw things differently. We were both distraught. We were both disappointed, but Martha hadn't lost her confidence in Jesus. Sure, I was confident that Jesus could have done something, but I felt so abandoned by the fact that he didn't, that I couldn't go with my sister to welcome his late arrival. When Martha returned, she went on and on about how Jesus had affirmed her faith. But how could Jesus abandon his friends and not come through for his loved ones? I went out to meet him. I couldn't even keep my composure. I fell at his feet, overwhelmed by my emotions. I simply wept and said, "Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died." And he looked at me. He saw my pain. He saw my discouragement, and he didn't say anything. Tears gathered in his eyes. I had so many questions in my heart, but I felt his tears. I felt in his tears the answer to my biggest question. Does Jesus still love me? In that moment, I knew one thing for sure. The answer was yes. And he asked, "Where have you put him?" I don't know why he didn't come 4 days earlier, and I don't know why we are going to the tomb again.
John chapter 11, we find ourselves in the home of Mary and Martha. We imagine the thoughts and emotions surrounding Lazarus' death. We read in John chapter 11, verse 1, "Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sister sent word to Jesus, 'Lord, the one who you love is sick.' When he heard this, Jesus said, 'The sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it.' Jesus loved Martha and her Mary sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days." We hear the scenario. The story plays out. Lazarus is sick, word goes to Jesus, and Jesus responds rather peculiarly to the request. He says, "Let's stay where we are 2 more days." Really, Jesus? I mean, it can't be that far of a journey to Bethany. We aren't exactly sure where Jesus is at the moment, but perhaps he could get there in time. But Jesus stays 2 more days. He interacts with the disciples. After 2 days, Jesus says, "Okay, let's go to Bethany." And we have to understand that as we follow the footsteps of Jesus here, he's coming toward the end of his time on earth. He knows that his mission, his journey to the cross is coming close. In fact, in John chapter 10, the authorities, the religious rulers, were out to kill Jesus. And so Jesus and his disciples had to retreat. And now Jesus is saying, "Let's go to Bethany." The disciples push back a little bit. They say, "Jesus, wait. You're basically asking for a life sentence here." Jesus gives a little analogy. He says, we read in the verses that follow, he says, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight?" And in that day, they measured time. The only measurement with time was daylight. And they would break up the daylight. They'd have a sundial, and they'd break up the daylight in 12 hours. And so Jesus is making an analogy of time and day and night. And he says, "Are there not 12 hours in the day?" And he tells his disciples, he's making an analogy saying, I'm still in the daytime. I'm still on my mission. It doesn't matter what people are out to do to me. I'm still on my mission, and night is coming, so there's still hours left in the day. And so they make the journey to Bethany. Thomas speaks up, one of Jesus' disciples. He says, "Okay, let us all go and be stoned. Let's all go and be killed with him." Kind of a realist in that moment saying, this is a dangerous move to go to Bethany. But they make the journey to Bethany, and Jesus arrives in town, and Martha goes and meets him outside the city. And she's grieving. She's grieving the loss of her brother. She says to Jesus in verse 21, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." She knows, she's seen Jesus' ministry. She saw him have compassion on the hurting, healing those who were sick. She knew that Jesus had power, and she had a relationship with Jesus. They had welcomed Jesus into their home. She was a friend, and Jesus arrived 4 days late. Even in the midst of her grief, though, where she still has faith in Jesus. She says, verse 22, "But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." In essence, she's saying, I don't understand why you're late. But I still believe that you are who you say you are, but I've got questions. I've got doubts. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been in the place in your walk of life where you had questions, perhaps doubts, struggles with God's timing? Questions, struggles, doubts with what you believe about God and how it plays out in your life. Mary and Martha are wrestling with this right now. Jesus takes a moment with Martha here, and he asks her a question. Or he actually, he doesn't ask her a question, he says it outright. He says, "Your brother will rise again." Now, the Pharisees and the religious rulers of that day had a pretty robust understanding of an end times resurrection. That at the end, God would resurrect his people. And so Martha believes that, and she says to Jesus, "I know that he will rise again at the resurrection in the last day." Jesus takes this moment to teach us something about the resurrection. He wants Martha to realize something here, and I think he wants each of us to realize, and as we're on this journey of Lent, anticipating the death and resurrection of Jesus, and what the significance of that is for us, Jesus is taking this moment with Martha to teach us something about the resurrection. He says to her in verse 25, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die." You see, what Jesus wants Martha to get here, and I think what he wants each of us to get, is I think we have to zoom out here in the Gospel of John. We have to understand that each of the gospel writers kind of writes with a different perspective. It's like if we all went out and observed something that happened, say there was a car accident on the street. We were kind of scattered around the block, and we each saw it happen, but we'd each have a different vantage point. All the vantage points are true, but perhaps each of us are telling our side of the story. And we're trying to communicate something about what we saw. Each of the gospel writers, as we read their accounts of the Gospels, they're each telling the story of Jesus. It's all true. They're each telling it from different perspectives. John here, he's a bit of the abstract thinker. I mean, he doesn't he starts the gospel with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." He's talking about Jesus coming into the world, but he's a bit of a theological thinker. He's got kind of this conceptual idea that he's trying to get across. And as his gospel goes on, in John chapter 1, verse 14, we have a really important verse there. John says, in John chapter 1, verse 14, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." Speaking of Jesus coming and God becoming flesh among us. And he says this, "And we have seen his glory, the glory of the as of the Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So as John's gospel goes on, he wants us to understand what this glory is. Now, in the church, often we refer to glory. We read it in the Psalms. The glory of God is displayed in the heavens. The glory of God. And sometimes I think it's a bit of a nebulous concept for us. It's like, God is glorious. Perhaps it's like shiny, distant, big, huge. It's this concept of God that perhaps we struggle to grasp. Here in John, glory for him is greatness. It's significance. It's identity. And so when John unfolds his gospel, he wants us to get the greatness, the significance, the identity of who Jesus is and what the significance is for us. In fact, in the end of John's gospel, he says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This is the purpose that John records this story here in John chapter 11. He wants us to get the glory of Jesus, who God is, who Jesus is, and what the significance of his greatness is. And here, as he says to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. He wants to teach us that what makes Jesus great is not that he has the remedy for our predicament in life. It's that he is the remedy. And this is an important distinction that John wants us to get here. Is that Jesus wasn't this healer that could have showed up 4 days earlier and healed Lazarus and fixed the predicament. But he wants Mary and Martha, and he wants you and I to get that he is the remedy. And what Jesus does here is he distinguishes from the abstract concept of resurrection. You see, Martha responds to him and says, I know, Lazarus is going to be raised in the end times. In the last days, he's going to be raised. And in the church, we believe that the resurrection of Jesus means that for all who put their faith in Jesus, when Jesus returns one day, he's going to raise all who put their faith in him, and they will be resurrected. That is something we believe. It is conceptual hope. But what Jesus wants us to get is that hope is not merely conceptual, it's personal. That hope is found not in a remedy that Jesus gives, but hope is found in the person of Jesus himself. What Jesus is getting at is that if we have placed our hope in him, it's not that he can fix our predicament. It's not merely that he saves us from our sins, but it's that he gives us himself. That he personally becomes the resurrection and the life. So that when we walk through suffering, when we walk through grieving, when we walk through those seasons where we have questions and doubts with God, he doesn't always give us the quick remedy to our predicament, but he always gives us himself. He wants us to know that he is life, that he is hope. He says to Martha, do you believe this? And this is what she says in verse 27. Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. Martha takes this a bit further. She not only believes this, but she affirms something that the Jewish people were waiting for. They were waiting for a Messiah, someone who would rescue them, who would deliver them from their sins. Martha proclaims, you are the one we've been waiting for. So Jesus goes with Martha, meets up with her sister Mary, and Mary's got her questions too. She says the same exact thing. John records that she has the same thing that she says to Jesus. Lord, if you had been here, Lazarus would not have died. They're all mourning, and in that day they'd have, the Jewish people would have professional mourners come out to the house when someone had passed away. And they'd mourn together. They'd wail together. They'd put on the sackcloths, and they'd start grieving together. And Mary's in this place of grief. We read in verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. I think deeply moved in spirit probably doesn't capture the full sense of this verb here. Deeply moved in spirit, he is indignant. This word here for deeply moved in spirit, it's the same verb that would be used of a horse when it would snort. You know when a horse snorts and just like lets out its power in that moment? That's what Jesus is feeling at this moment. You see, Jesus is assessing the situation, and he sees the mourning, and he's indignant. Why? Because he knows that he doesn't just have the remedy, he is the remedy. And he wants them to get that. He says to Mary, "Where have you laid him?" They said, "Come and see, Lord." Then we have two profound words that have become known as the shortest verse in the Bible. It's two words that are deeply significant as we read this passage. John chapter 11, verse 35 says, Jesus wept. There in that moment, tears well up in Jesus' eyes. Tears run down Jesus' cheeks. He cares. You see, the hope of the resurrection is grounded in the deep reality of who Jesus is. It's his plan that in the midst of our tears and the painful reality of suffering, that we would know that hope is not abstract. It's not some pie-in-the-sky theory. No, it's grounded in the concrete reality of the Word who took on flesh, Jesus himself, and made his dwelling among us. He knows our tears, he knows our suffering, and he weeps. And as his tears intermingle with ours, we begin to realize that our suffering does not negate his love. Because strangely so, if God had not showed up 4 days late, we would not have experienced Jesus in this passage like we will in a moment. You see, Jesus showed up 4 days late to show us that his love knows no limits and his glory reaches beyond the grave. Jesus is deeply moved to tears. He's feeling the weight of grief with the family, and the Jews that were gathered there said, "See how he loved it. He loved Lazarus." In fact, at the beginning of the passage, we heard John wants us to be sure that Jesus' love is sure. Like Jesus loves Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And so it wasn't because Jesus was unloving or that Jesus was cruel or anything that he stayed 2 more days and showed up 4 days late. In fact, it was because of his love that he showed up when he did. some of them gathered there are wrestling with the whole scenario. And they said in verse 37, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" It's a valid question. And perhaps a question that some of us have asked before. We read the gospel accounts and say, if Jesus could do this, why doesn't he do this in my life? Perhaps in our questioning, we wonder if his love is limited or that his power is limited. Or is there another reason that God was 4 days late? We read, as the passage goes on, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb, and it was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. Now, Martha is the practical one. If you'll remember, when Jesus shows up at their house, Martha's the one who's taking care of the meal, who's getting the house ready. She's that type A personality. And here, as she assesses the situation, Jesus says, "Take away the stone." She says, "But Lord, he's going to stink." I mean, they didn't have embalming as we do today. They knew that Lazarus is 4 days dead. I mean, he is going to stink. She says, "There's going to be an odor, Lord." And in that moment, Jesus says, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" Apparently, Martha gave the go-ahead, and they took away the stone. Jesus looks up and takes this moment as a teaching moment and speaks to the Father and says, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." I love how John puts it in verse 44. He doesn't say that Lazarus came out of the tomb. No, he wants us to get the deep, life-changing, powerful reality of the resurrection. He says in verse 44, "The dead man came out." His hands and feet wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." And that's how the story ends. That's all that John tells us here. We don't have reactions. We don't have what Lazarus did next. We don't have a record of what Mary and Martha were processing in that moment. But Jesus, here, as he raises a dead man from life, wants to teach us that the greatness of Jesus, that the remedy of the resurrection is not just some concept, it's a person. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And so as we think about the significance of Jesus rising from the dead, and as we celebrate that, this is a historical reality that Jesus rose from the dead, but not only that, it's a personal reality for you and me. Because we, like Lazarus, are laid in the tomb of death and sin and the death that we owe. And what we celebrate at Easter is that through the death of Jesus, he becomes our life. He rises from the dead so that his resurrection becomes our resurrection. So we have hope that there is life beyond the grave. Jesus says, "He who believes in me will live even though he dies." This is the glorious reality of the gospel, that even though we know suffering and pain and sickness and death in this world, we live. And this is the glorious reality of the resurrection, that it is not merely It is a future reality that the dead will rise. Those who've placed their faith in Jesus will rise. But I think what Jesus wanted to teach Mary and Martha here is that resurrection is a present reality for us. It's a present reality because Jesus is our resurrection in life. So that when we place our hope in Him, we have this life-changing perspective that when it seems God is 4 days late, we know that He is walking with us. That His plan is greater than ours. That when it seems that Jesus is 4 days late, we see His tears, that He weeps with us in our suffering, in our pain. Jesus doesn't merely have the remedy, He is the remedy. And when we let that sink in, we will know that our suffering in this world does not negate His love. In fact, it is our God's delight. It is Jesus' delight to show us that His life is experienced most fully and most deeply in the midst of our tears. The tears of this world are real, but so is the resurrection. And Jesus wants us to know that if we hold those two realities, whatever life brings our way, we can hold on to hope. We can hold on to Jesus. We can hold on to the deep reality that He loves us and He is our life and our resurrection. And as we do, it'll be like the sun that comes through the clouds. Mary and I love sunsets. We love sky. We love the sky. I mean, if you ever watch our videos or if you hang out with us near sunset time, you'll know that we love the beauty of a sunset. But one of the things I really, really love is when it's a cloudy day. It's just kind of gray and overcast and it's just gloomy. And all of a sudden there's just a break in the clouds. You know that moment where you can see the rays of sun just coming down? It's the same sun as any other day. But in the midst of the clouds, its beauty shines brighter. And this is the reality of the resurrection. That in the midst of suffering, in the midst of tears, the life-changing reality of knowing Jesus shines through even brighter. And Jesus delights sometimes in showing up 4 days late just to show us that.